She was mocked for talking to her plants, until scientists showed up at her door. Clara Bennett had always been something of a curiosity in the small town of Fernhill. A woman in her late 60s with wild, gray-streaked hair usually tied back with a faded ribbon, Clara moved through life with a rhythm all her own. Her home, a cozy, ivy-covered cottage on the outskirts of town, was surrounded by a garden that could only be described as otherworldly. While most neighbors struggled to keep their lawns green or their shrubs trimmed, Clara's plot of earth flourished in a way that defied logic, and sometimes even nature itself. At dawn, Clara could be seen out among her plants in a flowing housecoat, barefoot in the grass, whispering or sometimes singing softly to her vegetables and flowers. She would kneel before her tomato plants like a priestess tending to sacred relics, her voice lilting in a melody only she understood. People whispered. Some chuckled over coffee. Others called her odd. The phrase, "off her rocker," had been used more than once at the local diner. Still, Clara paid them no mind. The garden was her world, her refuge. She believed it had a soul. One morning, a neighbor, curious and a little amused, recorded Clara from across the hedge. In the video, she gently stroked the leaves of her tomato vines, humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby. She spoke to them, not like a gardener but like an old friend. "You're almost there, darlings. Just a little more sun today." The video, intended as a private joke, was posted online that evening. Within hours, it had caught fire. People around the world watched in wonder and disbelief as an elderly woman cooed lovingly to her vegetables. And while many laughed, others saw something more. Something they couldn't quite explain. Clara Bennett had lived in Fernhill for most of her life, though few could say they really knew her. A retired elementary school teacher, she had once filled chalkboards with lessons and lunchboxes with kind notes for her students. But after retiring and losing her husband, Thomas, to a sudden illness nearly a decade earlier, Clara had quietly receded from the rhythms of community life. She was polite, always offering a wave to neighbors and a soft thank you at the grocery store, but she rarely lingered for small talk. Instead, her days were filled with solitude, and her heart found solace in the soil. The cottage she called home had belonged to her grandmother, a fiercely independent woman who had taught Clara to garden before she could even read. Clara had inherited both the house and her grandmother's deep reverence for growing things. In her garden, she felt connected not just to the past, but to something alive, pulsing, and mysterious. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft give of dirt beneath her fingertips, it all gave her a sense of presence and peace. When Thomas passed, Clara found herself drifting in grief's heavy fog. Words failed her, and the house felt unbearably silent. One morning, instinctively, she began speaking to her plants. It started with simple things, commenting on their progress, wondering aloud about the weather. Slowly, it became a ritual. She'd greet them by name, sing to them softly, even apologize if she had to trim them back. It wasn't madness to her. It was connection. Clara believed that plants could sense her emotions. When she was joyful, her garden thrived. When she was sorrowful, the leaves drooped. In the quiet world of green life, she found empathy, and in turn, gave it freely. It didn't take long for the whispers in Fernhill to turn into pointed jokes. The moment Clara's video went viral, townsfolk who had once ignored her suddenly had opinions. Teenagers walking past her garden snickered and mimicked her soft-spoken words. A few of them took to calling her the plant whisperer, a nickname that quickly caught on. At first, it was murmured with amusement. Soon it was said with mocking laughter. Clara heard the teasing. How could she not? It echoed from porch stoops, grocery store aisles, and whispered conversations that paused awkwardly when she walked by. People who had once been content to ignore her now saw her as entertainment. A curiosity. Something to gossip about over pie and coffee at the diner. Then came the article. The Fernhill Gazette, known more for bake sale coverage than journalism, published a front-page feature titled, "The Garden Enchantress. Local Woman Sings to Her Spinach." Though the tone pretended affection, the article was laced with sarcasm and disbelief. They referred to her morning routines as rituals, framed her garden as a mystery bordering on myth, and described Clara with the kind of language usually reserved for eccentrics and outcasts. But Clara didn't flinch. The next morning, she was back in her garden, speaking softly to her petunias. While the town snickered and scoffed, something far more curious was unfolding within the boundaries of Clara's garden. Her vegetables were thriving, not just healthy, but unnaturally large and vibrant. Tomatoes swelled to the size of softballs, with skins so taut and glossy they looked polished. Lettuce heads were lush and tightly layered weeks before the expected harvest time. Her roses, normally late bloomers, had opened in full fiery color even as the last frost lingered on her neighbors' lawns. Clara noticed these changes with a mix of wonder and quiet validation. She had always believed there was something real about her bond with her plants, but now she had proof. Determined to understand what was happening, she began keeping meticulous records. Each morning, she logged the time, the weather, what she said or sang, and the plant's condition. She collected soil samples and noted moisture levels, even tracking moon phases and the types of music she played near the beds. She began running small experiments, singing lullabies to one bed of peppers and simply humming near another. The ones she spoke to directly, especially in soothing tones, grew faster and appeared stronger. When she scolded a drooping fern half-jokingly for being dramatic, its leaves perked up by the next morning. She even noticed that different plants reacted to different approaches. Her morning glories responded to cheerful chatter, while the basil seemed to thrive on calm silence. It was, to Clara, like getting to know a group of individuals, each with quirks, temperaments, and rhythms. She didn't fully understand it, but she documented every detail with the care of a scientist. Something unusual was happening in that garden, and though the world might have laughed, Clara felt certain her plants were listening, and maybe, just maybe, responding in kind. It was a quiet afternoon when the sleek black SUV rolled onto Clara's gravel driveway, the rumble of its engine a jarring contrast to the gentle stillness of her garden. Clara looked up from pruning her marigolds, shielding her eyes against the sun as two figures stepped out, both dressed not in government black but in the slightly rumpled attire of academics. One carried a leather-bound notebook, the other a tablet and a portable soil tester. They introduced themselves as Dr. Anya Morales and Dr. Colin Reeve from the National Botanical Research Institute. Both were polite, clearly cautious not to offend, though there was a subtle urgency in their voices. Dr. Morales explained that the institute had been quietly cataloging reports of anomalous plant behavior across the country. Clara's garden, and more specifically the viral video of her speaking to her tomatoes, had piqued their curiosity like nothing else. She expected mockery or skepticism, but there was none. Instead, they spoke in terms of biofeedback, plant response systems, and environmental acoustics. They asked, almost reverently, if they could study her garden, observe it firsthand, run non-invasive tests, maybe replicate some of her interactions. Clara, after a moment's pause and a steadying breath, gave a simple nod. "As long as you treat them kindly," she said. Though hesitant at first, Clara agreed to let the researchers proceed, provided they treated her plants with care and didn't uproot anything unnecessarily. Her garden, after all, wasn't a lab to her, it was a sanctuary. Dr. Morales and Dr. Reeve set up with quiet efficiency, explaining every step as they brought in equipment that looked both alien and fascinating to Clara's eyes. Thermal imaging cameras, directional microphones, UV light sensors, and devices designed to measure microvibrations in soil and leaves. They began by sectioning off areas of the garden, isolating patches of identical plants to serve as control groups. One group would receive no interaction, another would be spoken to by Clara, another by the researchers, and yet another subjected to pre-recorded audio clips of Clara's voice. Every detail, light, moisture, temperature, was kept consistent across the groups. The only variable was the human voice. Over several days, the garden transformed into a quiet hub of observation. The researchers came at dawn and stayed until dusk, their equipment humming softly as Clara went about her usual routine. She spoke gently to her basil, sang softly to her sunflowers, and greeted her squash vines like old friends. It felt strange being watched, but also validating. Soon, patterns began to emerge. The thermal cameras showed subtle but repeatable heat signatures in the leaves of plants exposed to Clara's voice, an indication of increased metabolic activity. The growth rates in her spoken-to patches began outpacing the control groups significantly. Sound wave analysis showed microresponses, tiny trembles in the stems, when Clara spoke at certain frequencies or with particular emotional tones. It wasn't just anecdotal anymore. Clara's bond with her plants, once the subject of gossip and ridicule, was now the center of something groundbreaking. Even the scientists looked amazed. After weeks of rigorous testing and observation, the researchers gathered in Clara's small kitchen one evening, surrounded by steaming mugs of chamomile tea and stacks of data printouts. Dr. Reeve, flipping through thermal imaging results and growth graphs, leaned back with a look of awe. "It's not just the tone," he said slowly, "it's the way you speak. Your voice hits a frequency, subtle, low range, that seems to stimulate something in the plants. It's like a biological resonance." Dr. Morales chimed in, referencing recent but still controversial work in plant neurobiology. There's growing evidence that plants process stimuli in ways we're only beginning to understand: electrochemical signaling, responsive growth patterns, even memory-like behavior. Your garden is behaving like a living system reacting to emotional cues. She looked at Clara with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "You may be doing something extraordinary without even realizing it." With a mixture of humor and reverence, they'd already started calling it the Bennett effect. Before leaving that night, they made Clara an offer. They wanted to publish a formal paper on the findings, with Clara listed as a co-author. "You didn't just grow this garden," Dr. Morales said. "You changed how we think about communication with life itself." Clara, quietly stunned, nodded. When the research paper on the Bennett effect was published in a respected botanical journal, the story didn't just stay within scientific circles, it exploded into the mainstream. Within days, Clara Bennett, once the quiet widow at the edge of Fernhill, was fielding interview requests from every major media outlet in the country. News vans parked outside her gate, drones buzzed over her garden for aerial shots, and camera crews begged for a glimpse of the woman who spoke to plants and made them listen. Clara appeared on morning shows, seated among bouquets of her own blossoms, speaking humbly about her lifelong love of gardening and how her conversations with her plants were never meant for attention. She wasn't trying to change the world. She was just trying to heal. Opinion pieces poured in, some marveling at the implications of the research, others dismissing it as pseudoscience. Botanists, biologists, and philosophers argued passionately about the possibility of interspecies communication. While skeptics scoffed, an increasing number of scientists demanded new funding to explore plant responsiveness, acoustic stimulation, and emotional resonance in living systems. Meanwhile, Clara's garden became a destination. People traveled from across the country and even overseas to see the space where it all began. They walked quietly between the flower beds, whispered to leaves, and sat in silence among the rows of vegetables. Some swore they felt something, an energy, a calm, a presence. Garden clubs sent letters of admiration. Universities invited Clara to speak, though she politely declined most of them. Despite the chaos, Clara remained herself. She still rose at dawn, still hummed softly to her basil, and still tended her soil with the same quiet love. To her, the attention was secondary. What mattered most was that, finally, the world was listening, to her, and maybe to the plants too. The change in Fernhill was subtle at first, fewer whispers behind Clara's back, more polite nods at the market. Then came the more awkward gestures: fresh pies left on her porch, handwritten notes slipped into her mailbox, neighbors suddenly remembering stories of how they always knew she had something special. The same teenagers who once called her the plant whisperer now offered to help carry mulch or asked for advice on starting their own gardens. The town, sensing its newfound fame, organized its first annual Fernhill Garden Festival, proudly naming Clara the guest of honor. Banners with watercolor renderings of her roses lined the main street, and vendors sold Bennett Blend seed packets inspired by her garden. Though overwhelmed by the attention, Clara attended with quiet grace, answering questions, smiling for photos, and walking among the booths with the same straw hat she'd always worn. The local community center invited her to teach weekly gardening workshops, and to everyone's surprise, she accepted. Her sessions weren't lectures but gentle, hands-on afternoons where she showed people how to listen to their plants, how to care, how to connect. Through kindness, patience, and an open heart, Clara Bennett won over the very people who once dismissed her. And they were better for it. With the attention came the offers, shiny, seductive, and overwhelming. Biotech firms emailed proposals filled with dollar signs and intellectual property clauses. A streaming service pitched a feel-good documentary series, while another company wanted to produce a line of Bennett Method plant care products, complete with her name and likeness on the packaging. Lawyers and agents offered representation. Publicists promised to elevate her brand. Clara sat at her kitchen table night after night, poring over the contracts with her reading glasses sliding down her nose. None of it felt right. The garden had been her refuge, not her revenue stream. What had begun as whispered conversations between her and her begonias now risked being turned into a franchise. She consulted with Dr. Morales and a trusted lawyer from town. After much thought, Clara made her decision. She would accept a portion of the research rights, not for herself, but to fund something meaningful. A large share would be donated to global plant conservation groups and reforestation projects, in honor of the quiet wisdom of the green world that had healed her. With the rest, she expanded her own garden into a community space. Raised beds, sensory gardens, pollinator pathways, and learning plots were installed. Children came to plant their first seeds, elders came to share tips and stories. Clara hired local gardeners, some of them once skeptics, now turned stewards of the soil. She declined the commercial endorsements. "You can't package something sacred," she told one persistent executive. "You can only share it quietly." In the end, Clara didn't cash in on her gift. She let it grow, like her garden had, patiently, rooted in care and humility. The miracle was never for sale. It was for everyone. Clara often sat on the old wooden bench beneath the sprawling fig tree, a quiet spot at the edge of her expanded garden. Here, she reflected not on the whirlwind of media attention or sudden fame, but on something deeper, an evolution of understanding. What had started as an intimate ritual born from grief had grown into a bridge between two living worlds. She hadn't changed who she was, she had simply shared what she'd always known, that connection matters, even in silence. To Clara, plants were not passive greenery. They were companions, responsive, attentive, even expressive in their own way. They thrived not just on sunlight and water, but on presence, voice, and care. She didn't claim to speak a secret language. She simply believed that attention, given sincerely, had power. The researchers, once cautious and clinical, now echoed her belief in published papers and lectures. While they didn't make grand metaphysical claims, they acknowledged that human interaction, especially consistent, compassionate engagement, might play a role in plant health that science was only beginning to understand. Clara still spoke to her garden each morning. But now she was often joined by others, children, students, travelers, who sat among the blooms, whispered to leaves, and listened, just as she always had. Years passed, and Clara's garden blossomed into more than a local wonder. It became a center of learning, exploration, and quiet revolution. What was once the private sanctuary of a soft-spoken widow now stood as a living testament to the power of listening, curiosity, and compassion. Researchers from across the globe visited regularly, setting up new experiments and refining tools to better study the nuances of plant sensory perception and response. But no matter how advanced the technology became, the heart of it all remained Clara's unshakable belief in connection. The garden evolved into a hybrid space, a research site, a teaching ground, and a sanctuary open to the public. Children came for weekend programs, learning how to plant, nurture, and observe. University students interned under visiting botanists. Locals wandered the winding paths in the evening light, many of them still amazed by the transformation of a space and a woman they had once dismissed. Outside the entrance stood a modest bronze plaque, mounted on a weathered stone near the gate. To those who listen, even when others laugh, the Clara Bennett Garden for Living Communication. One spring morning, under the flowering archway of clematis and jasmine, Clara knelt beside a patch of lavender with a young girl by her side, wide-eyed and full of questions. The girl tugged Clara's sleeve and asked with earnest wonder, "Do they really hear you?" Clara didn't answer right away. She smiled gently, pressed her hand into the soil beside the lavender, and leaned close to the stems. Then, softly, she whispered, "Why don't you ask them yourself?" The girl bent forward, giggled nervously, and whispered to the plant. And in that moment, surrounded by sunlight and possibility, the garden listened, just as it always had.